The hum of cooling fans fills the darkness. Then, slowly, light bleeds into the frame. The cold blue-green glow of a dozen monitors arranged in a semicircle, their screens alive with cascading code, rotating blueprints, and security camera feeds cycling through empty corridors. In the center of it all sits a figure. Leather jacket, gray beanie pulled low over his forehead, a beard that hasn't been trimmed in weeks obscuring the lower half of his face. He doesn't move. He barely blinks. Around his feet, stacks of cash lie scattered like debris after a storm. Hundreds of thousands of dollars he hasn't bothered to count or organize. He doesn't care about the money on the floor. He's watching the money on the screens. This man doesn't look like a criminal mastermind. He looks like someone who fixes air conditioners for a living. Someone you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Someone who blends into crowds and disappears into subway cars and orders coffee at diners, where nobody remembers his face. His name is Zelensky Ultreich Abramovich, and in approximately 4 hours, he will steal $1.2 billion from the most secure casino system ever built, without touching a single chip, without stepping foot inside the building, without anyone knowing he exists until it's far, far too late. This is the story of how a ghost from Moscow infiltrated America's gambling empire, executed the largest cyber heist in history, and vanished so completely that 5 years later, the FBI still doesn't know which continent he's on. Before we get into it, make sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any episodes. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I'm always curious to know. Atlantic City, New Jersey, January 2019. A Greyhound bus pulled into the station at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning so cold that the windows had frosted over during the night. Most passengers stumbled off half asleep, clutching coffee cups and dragging luggage toward waiting cars or taxi stands. One man moved differently. He stepped off the bus with nothing but a single black suitcase and a laptop bag slung over one shoulder. No phone visible. No earbuds. No distraction. His eyes swept the station methodically, the security cameras positioned near the exits, the transit police officer scrolling through his phone by the vending machines, the homeless man curled beneath newspapers on a bench near the restrooms. Zelensky Ultreich Abramovich had been in America for less than 30 seconds, and he'd already identified every potential threat within 100 meters. He was 34 years old. He carried a passport that identified him as Viktor Andreev, a software consultant from Estonia. The passport was flawless, not a forgery, technically, but a genuine document issued under a carefully constructed false identity that had taken 3 years to establish. Viktor Andreev had a credit history. Viktor Andreev had employment records. Viktor Andreev had a LinkedIn profile with 17 connections and a professional headshot taken at a shopping mall photography studio in Tallinn. Viktor Andreev was, for all practical purposes, a real person. Zelensky Ultreich Abramovich was not. The man who stepped off that bus had been trained in Moscow's FSB cyber warfare division before he was old enough to legally drink. By 22, he'd penetrated defense networks in 4 NATO countries. By 26, he'd been recruited by a syndicate with ties to Eastern European organized crime families who recognized something valuable in him. Not just his skills, but his temperament. Zelensky didn't panic. Zelensky didn't rush. Zelensky could sit in a room for 18 months watching data streams scroll across screens, and his heartbeat would never rise above 60. The syndicate had given him a target: Meridian Grand Casino, the crown jewel of Atlantic City's gambling industry. Meridian wasn't just a casino. It was a technology company that happened to run gaming floors. Their digital infrastructure processed $2.3 billion in transactions annually. Their security systems had been designed by former NSA contractors. Their network architecture was considered, by people who evaluated such things, essentially impenetrable. Zelensky had read their technical documentation. He'd studied their patent filings. He'd mapped their vendor relationships and identified every third-party contractor who'd ever touched their systems. He knew exactly where the vulnerabilities were. Within 48 hours of arriving in Atlantic City, Zelensky had rented a warehouse in a forgotten industrial district 3 miles from the boardwalk. The building had been empty for 6 years, a former textile storage facility that still smelled faintly of machine oil and decay. The rent was cheap. The landlord asked no questions. The electrical infrastructure could handle the load Zelensky was about to place on it. Over the following weeks, unmarked packages arrived. Monitors, servers, networking equipment, hardware that couldn't be traced to any legitimate purchase. Zelensky assembled his command center piece by piece, running cables along the walls, mounting screens in precise configurations, testing connections until everything hummed in perfect synchronization. The walls filled with documents, network diagrams printed on oversized paper, employee photographs downloaded from social media and corporate websites, building schematics obtained through sources Zelensky never discussed. He studied the patterns of Meridian's IT staff. He learned their schedules, their habits, their weaknesses. He identified a man named Konstantin Dreyfus, 52 years old, former director of IT security at a competing casino, fired 2 years earlier after a gambling addiction destroyed his career and his marriage. Konstantin knew Meridian's systems because he'd helped design the industry standards they were built on. Zelensky didn't approach him with money. Money was crude. Instead, he offered something Konstantin wanted more desperately than cash: revenge against the industry that had chewed him up and spit him out. The infiltration took 18 months. Zelensky never rushed. He planted malware and routine software updates that Meridian's own security teams approved without a second glance. He established shell companies across 23 jurisdictions. He built cryptocurrency conversion pipelines that could fragment any sum into untraceable fragments within minutes. And he waited. By March 2021, Zelensky Ultreich Abramovich was ready. He sat in his leather chair, surrounded by monitors and mountains of cash he'd accumulated from practice runs, small breaches disguised as accounting errors that no one had ever connected to a larger pattern. The screens glowed green in the darkness. The data stream scrolled. Somewhere across town, the Meridian Grand Casino sparkled against the Atlantic City skyline, its executives celebrating another record quarter, utterly unaware that a ghost was about to take everything they had. The first thing Zelensky did after leaving the warehouse was walk. Not toward the casino. Not yet. First, he needed to understand the city itself, its rhythms, its blind spots, its invisible architecture of surveillance and neglect. He walked for 3 hours that first afternoon, hands stuffed in the pockets of his leather jacket, breath fogging in the January air. He noted which intersections had traffic cameras and which didn't. He identified the patrol patterns of Atlantic City police cruisers. He found the coffee shops where locals gathered and the diners where strangers could sit for hours without anyone remembering their faces. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky above the Atlantic in shades of orange and gray, Zelensky had mapped the city in his mind with the precision of a military strategist preparing for invasion, which, in a sense, was exactly what he was. He entered the Meridian Grand Casino at 7:23 p.m., timing his arrival to coincide with the shift change he'd read about in employee reviews posted on job websites. The casino floor stretched before him like a glittering fever dream. Thousands of slot machines arranged in precise rows, their screens flashing promises of fortune, their speakers emitting a constant symphony of electronic celebration. Tourists wandered between gaming tables clutching cocktails. High rollers occupied private rooms behind frosted glass partitions. Security personnel in dark suits stood at calculated intervals, their eyes scanning crowds with practiced detachment. Zelensky moved through it all like water through rock, present but unremarkable, flowing around obstacles without creating disturbance. He wasn't there to gamble. He was there to study. He counted cameras, 47 on the main floor alone, positioned to eliminate blind spots, their feeds presumably monitored by a security team in some windowless room deep in the building's infrastructure. He watched the guards, their patrol routes, their attention spans, the moments when their vigilance flickered and they checked phones or chatted with colleagues. He observed the IT staff who occasionally emerged from service corridors, identified by the badge colors that distinguished them from other employees. Most importantly, he studied the machines themselves, not the slot machines. Those were irrelevant to his purposes. He was interested in the terminals, the points of sale systems, the digital kiosks where guests converted cash to credits and credits back to cash. Every transaction that passed through those systems traveled along cables to servers, and those servers connected to networks, and those networks had edges where security thinned and vulnerabilities emerged. Zelensky spent 90 minutes on the casino floor. He didn't place a single bet. He bought one drink, a ginger ale, because alcohol dulled the senses, and nursed it while sitting at a bar with a clear sight line to the main cage where cashiers processed the largest transactions. When he left, no one noticed. No camera operator flagged his face for the database. No security guard remembered the bearded man in the gray beanie who'd wandered through their empire like a ghost passing through walls. Back at the warehouse, Zelensky began his real work. The monitors he'd installed formed a semicircle around his leather chair, a throne of information from which he would conduct his war. On the largest screen, he pulled up everything publicly available about Meridian Grand's technical infrastructure. Patent filings revealed the architecture of their proprietary transaction systems. Job postings described the certifications required for their IT staff, which told them what software platforms they used. Vendor announcements celebrated partnerships with specific cybersecurity firms, which told him what defensive tools he'd need to circumvent. The walls became a gallery of intelligence. Photographs of Meridian's executive team, downloaded from press releases and conference presentations. Organizational charts reconstructed from LinkedIn connections. Network diagrams sketched by hand based on inference and educated speculation. Building schematics obtained through channels Zelensky never documented, because some sources were valuable precisely because they remained secret. He worked through the night, pausing only to eat protein bars and drink black coffee that grew cold in its mug. By dawn, the warehouse had transformed from an empty shell into something that resembled a military command center, or perhaps the lair of a predator who had chosen his prey and was now calculating the perfect angle of attack. Zelensky had been doing this for 12 years. He'd penetrated systems that governments had sworn were impenetrable. He'd extracted data from networks protected by the best security money could buy. He'd operated in the shadows of a digital world where the consequences of failure weren't termination letters or bad performance reviews. They were prison cells and unmarked graves. The syndicate that employed him understood his value. They'd found him in Moscow when he was 26, already legendary in certain circles for infiltrating defense networks across 4 NATO countries. They'd offered him something the Russian state never had: freedom. The FSB had treated him as a tool, a weapon to be aimed at targets chosen by bureaucrats with political agendas. The syndicate treated him as an artist, allowing him to select his own canvases and paint whatever masterpieces his talents could conceive. The Meridian Grand was his most ambitious canvas yet. If you're not subscribed yet, just remember, Zelensky walked into a billion-dollar fortress, mapped every blind spot, and vanished before anyone realized the game had even started. That's what happens when you wait too long to pay attention. Don't be the security guard sipping a latte while your empire burns. Hit subscribe now, or drop into the comments and explain why you'd rather sleep through a masterclass in digital war. We'll wait. Months passed like data packets through fiber optic cables, silent, invisible, relentless. The warehouse evolved. What had begun as a sparse command center became something more elaborate, more alive. Additional monitors arrived in unmarked shipments, expanding the semicircle until Zelensky sat at the center of a glowing wall of information. Server racks hummed against the back wall, their fans creating a constant white noise that became the soundtrack of his existence. Cables snaked across the concrete floor like the nervous system of some digital organism, connecting machines that never slept to networks that spanned continents. And the cash accumulated. Stacks of bills appeared in corners, on tables, eventually spilling onto the floor in careless piles that Zelensky stepped over without acknowledgement. Practice runs. Test breaches. Small incursions into peripheral systems that netted 50,000 here, 100,000 there. Accounting errors that Meridian's finance teams wrote off as glitches. Rounding discrepancies. The inevitable friction of processing billions of dollars annually. Each successful extraction proved his theories correct and refined his understanding of the target's vulnerabilities. Zelensky never celebrated these victories. He logged them, analyzed them, and moved to the next phase. Spring melted into summer. Summer burned into fall. The world outside the warehouse continued its ordinary rotations. Tourists flooding Atlantic City's beaches, then retreating as temperatures dropped. The Meridian Grand Casino, announcing record quarterly profits at shareholder meetings. Executives giving interviews about their revolutionary security infrastructure, their impenetrable digital fortress. Zelensky read those interviews. He saved them. Sometimes, late at night, he would pull them up on one of his monitors and study the faces of the men who believed they had built something unbreakable. Their confidence amused him. They trusted their systems the way medieval lords had trusted their castle walls, never imagining that the real threat wouldn't come through the gates, but would materialize inside, already past every defense, patient and invisible. By the time autumn arrived, Zelensky had identified his inside man. Konstantin Dreyfus lived in a one-bedroom apartment in a forgotten corner of Newark, 60 miles from the industry that had created and destroyed him. At 52, he was a wreckage of the man who had once commanded respect in casino security circles. His career had ended 2 years earlier at the Bellagio Grand in Las Vegas, where he'd served as director of IT security until a gambling addiction metastasized into embezzlement. The addiction had always been there, a dark irony that someone responsible for protecting gaming systems couldn't resist the games themselves. But desperation had transformed weakness into crime, and crime had transformed a respected professional into a cautionary tale whispered at industry conferences. Zelensky had found him through careful excavation of professional networks and public records. Konstantin's name appeared in patent filings for security protocols that had become industry standards, the same standards that Meridian Grand had adopted when building their systems. He knew the architecture because he'd helped design the template. He understood the vulnerabilities because he'd watched the industry cut corners to meet budgets and deadlines. Their first meeting took place in a diner near Konstantin's apartment. Zelensky arrived first, selecting a booth in the back corner with clear sight lines to both exits. When Konstantin shuffled in, unshaven, wearing clothes that hadn't been new in years, carrying the defeated posture of a man who had stopped expecting anything good, Zelensky felt nothing resembling sympathy. He felt recognition. Here was a tool, properly broken, ready to be repurposed. Zelensky didn't offer money. Money was what desperate people expected, and offering it would have positioned him as just another transaction in Konstantin's long slide toward oblivion. Instead, he offered something that made Konstantin's eyes flicker with the first sign of life he'd shown in months. Revenge. The people who had destroyed Konstantin weren't the executives who'd fired him or the prosecutors who'd let him plead down to probation. The real enemy was the industry itself. The same industry that had exploited his talents for decades, paid him a fraction of what his innovations were worth, and then discarded him the moment his humanity became inconvenient. Zelensky understood this because he'd studied it. He knew exactly which words would transform Konstantin from a broken man into a willing collaborator. Within a week, Konstantin was providing detailed documentation of Meridian's security architecture. Within a month, he'd identified the specific contractors who handled routine software updates, contractors whose systems were far less protected than Meridian's own infrastructure. Within 3 months, he'd mapped the entire chain of digital trust that connected Meridian's impenetrable fortress to the outside world. Zelensky used this intelligence to plant his malware. The code was elegant in its simplicity, small packets hidden within legitimate software updates, approved by Meridian's own security teams, welcomed through the front door like Trojan horses disguised as gifts. Once inside, the malware did nothing. It sat dormant, invisible, waiting for activation commands that wouldn't come for months. Meanwhile, Zelensky constructed the financial architecture of his heist. Shell companies bloomed across 23 jurisdictions: the Cayman Islands, Estonia, Singapore, Cyprus, Malta, and a dozen other territories where corporate secrecy was a commodity and questions were bad for business. Each company existed only on paper, connected to the next through layers of ownership so complex that forensic accountants would spend years trying to untangle them. Cryptocurrency exchanges completed the laundering pipeline. Bitcoin, Ethereum, Monero, privacy coins designed specifically to frustrate tracking. Every dollar that Zelensky extracted from Meridian would fragment into thousands of pieces, scatter across the blockchain, reconverge in wallets controlled by keys that existed only in his memory, and finally emerge, clean, untraceable, in accounts that no government would ever find. 18 months after stepping off that Greyhound bus, Zelensky Ultreich Abramovich was ready. His command center glowed with accumulated intelligence. His malware slept inside Meridian systems. His financial infrastructure stood prepared to receive and vanish more money than most people could conceptualize. All that remained was execution. March 14th, 2021, the day before everything changed. Zelensky woke at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before his alarm was set to sound. His body had learned to anticipate significant moments, pulling him from sleep with the reliability of military training that never fully faded. He lay still in the narrow cot he'd installed in a corner of the warehouse, staring at the ceiling where shadows flickered from monitors that never powered down, and he allowed himself 60 seconds of stillness before beginning the most important day of his life. 3,000 miles away, in a cramped apartment in Minsk, a 28-year-old hacker who knew Zelensky only as a voice on an encrypted channel was finalizing the ransomware payload. In Odessa, another operative, older, more cautious, a veteran of Ukrainian cyber units before the money drew him elsewhere, was confirming access to the delivery vectors they'd spent months preparing. In Bucharest, the youngest member of the remote team, barely 23 and recruited from dark web forums where his skills had attracted dangerous attention, was running final tests on the distraction that would consume Meridian's defenses. None of them knew Zelensky's real name. None of them knew the true purpose of the attack they were about to launch. They believed they were executing a ransomware operation, encrypt the casino's systems, demand payment in cryptocurrency, disappear with the proceeds. Standard cybercrime, the kind that generated headlines for a few days before the world moved on. They didn't know they were lighting a fire so that Zelensky could rob the vault while everyone watched the flames. The attack began at 9:17 a.m., time to strike during the morning shift overlap when Meridian's IT staff would be at maximum capacity but minimum coordination. The ransomware propagated through the systems with elegant violence, encrypting databases, locking terminals, spreading through network segments that should have been isolated but weren't. Within 11 minutes, the Meridian Grand Casino's digital infrastructure had transformed from a precision instrument into a screaming chaos of error messages and frozen screens. Zelensky watched it unfold from his command center, 3 miles away. One monitor displayed a real-time feed of social media posts from Meridian employees, confused tweets, alarmed Facebook updates, the inevitable leaks that occurred when hundreds of workers simultaneously encountered something they'd never trained for. Another monitor tracked news aggregators, waiting for the story to break into mainstream coverage. A third displayed the internal communications his dormant malware was silently harvesting from Meridian's compromised servers. The panic was beautiful in its predictability. By 10:30 a.m., Meridian's chief technology officer had convened an emergency response team in a conference room on the casino's 3rd floor. Zelensky couldn't see inside that room, but he could read the fragments of communication flowing through the systems his malware had infiltrated. Frantic messages to the CEO, demands for status updates from the board, arguments about whether to pay the ransom or attempt recovery from backups that might or might not be compromised. By noon, the FBI Cyber Division had dispatched a response team from their Newark field office. Zelensky tracked their arrival through traffic cameras he'd accessed months earlier as part of his broader surveillance architecture. 3 black SUVs. 7 agents. The kind of federal response that meant Meridian had acknowledged the severity of their situation and called for reinforcement. Everyone was looking at the fire. Zelensky spent the afternoon in methodical preparation. He checked his systems, every connection, every failsafe, every escape route. He reviewed the timing of his extraction protocols, rehearsing the sequence of commands he would execute when midnight arrived. He verified that his cryptocurrency pipelines were operational, that the shell companies were ready to receive incoming transfers, that the dormant code sleeping inside Meridian's transaction systems had survived the ransomware chaos without detection. The ransomware was designed to fail. By evening, Meridian's recovery team, augmented by the FBI specialists and emergency contractors flown in from Silicon Valley, would locate the kill switch Zelensky's operatives had deliberately left accessible. They would decrypt their systems. They would breathe sighs of relief. They would congratulate themselves on surviving a crisis and begin the long process of forensic analysis to understand how they'd been breached. They would never notice the real intrusion. The sun set over Atlantic City at 7:23 p.m., painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that Zelensky observed through the warehouse's grimy windows. He ate a protein bar. He drank black coffee. He reviewed his calculations one final time, confirming that the numbers aligned, that his projections about Meridian's transaction volumes and account structures remained accurate. At 11:30 p.m., Zelensky settled into his leather chair for the last time. The monitors glowed around him, displaying dashboards and data streams, and the cascading results of 18 months of patient preparation. Cash covered the floor in careless mountains, the accumulated proceeds of practice runs that now seemed trivial compared to what was coming. His beanie was pulled low. His leather jacket hung on the back of the chair. His hands rested on the keyboard, steady as stone. Somewhere across town, FBI agents were packing up their equipment, satisfied that the crisis had been contained. Meridian executives were drafting press releases about their swift and effective response. Security teams were standing down from high alert. Zelensky watched the clock on his primary monitor count down the final minutes. 11:58 p.m. 11:59 p.m. He took a single breath, held it, released it slowly. Midnight. Imagine thinking the fire was the crisis, while the real thief emptied your vault in silence. That's what this series is. You're watching a misdirection unfold in real time. And if you're not subscribed, you're the mark. Smash that button now, before this channel turns into your Meridian Grand. Still not subscribing? Fine. Tell us in the comments why you're comfortable being blindsided like a rookie analyst on the graveyard shift. Zelensky's fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of a concert pianist performing a piece rehearsed 10,000 times. 12:01 a.m. The first command executed. Deep inside Meridian Grand's transaction infrastructure, dormant code that had slept for months suddenly awakened. The malware didn't announce itself with alarms or visible disruptions. It simply began doing what Zelensky had designed it to do, initiating wire transfers through pathways that appeared entirely legitimate, using credentials harvested from administrators who had no idea their access had been cloned, moving money through channels that Meridian's own systems recognized as authorized. The first transaction was $1.4 million, routed to a shell company registered in Singapore that existed only as a digital signature on incorporation documents filed 18 months earlier. The second was $2.1 million, directed to an account in the Cayman Islands held by a trust whose beneficial owner was another shell, which was owned by another shell, which eventually traced back to a cryptocurrency wallet that would exist for approximately 47 minutes before its contents scattered across the blockchain like seeds in a hurricane. By 12:07 a.m., 43 transactions had completed successfully. By 12:15 a.m., the number had risen to 112. The money flowed outward from Meridian's accounts in streams that merged and diverged and merged again, passing through Estonia and Cyprus and Malta, in jurisdictions whose banking secrecy laws have been designed specifically to frustrate exactly the kind of investigation that would eventually attempt to trace these funds. Zelensky watched the confirmation scroll across his monitors like a meditation. Each successful transfer appeared as a green line of text, amount, destination, timestamp, before vanishing upward as new confirmations replaced it. The rhythm was hypnotic. The scale was staggering. Numbers that would have seemed abstract in any other context became viscerally real as they accumulated. 50 million, then 100 million, then $200 million flowing through his systems and fragmenting into untraceable cryptocurrency before Meridian security teams had any indication that something far worse than ransomware had invaded their infrastructure. 3 miles away, those security teams were celebrating. The ransomware had been defeated. The kill switch had worked. Systems were coming back online. FBI agents were shaking hands with exhausted IT staff, congratulating them on a crisis managed effectively. Someone had ordered pizza. Someone else was already drafting the incident report that would eventually be filed with regulators and insurance companies. No one was watching the transaction logs. At 2:34 a.m., Zelensky passed the $800 million threshold. His fingers hadn't trembled once. His heartbeat had remained steady. He'd eaten nothing, drunk nothing, taken no breaks. The world outside the warehouse had ceased to exist. There was only the code, the confirmations, the beautiful mathematics of destruction playing out exactly as he calculated. At 3:12 a.m., he crossed $1 billion. The number hung on his screen for a moment, a 10-digit figure that represented more wealth than most nations' annual budgets, more money than the combined lifetime earnings of everyone he'd ever known. Zelensky allowed himself to look at it, to acknowledge what he'd accomplished. Then he returned to work, because the operation wasn't finished until every vulnerable dollar had been extracted and every trace of his presence had been erased. At 3:47 a.m., a junior analyst named Theodore Bobek noticed something wrong. Theodore was 26 years old, 3 years in his career at Meridian, working the overnight shift because seniority determined schedules, and he had none. He'd spent most of the night running system checks as servers came back online after the ransomware attack. Routine work, boring work, the kind of work that made you stare at screens until your eyes blurred and numbers stopped meaning anything. But one number caught his attention. A discrepancy in the overnight transaction summary that didn't match the expected volume for a Sunday night. He checked it again, checked a third time. Then he felt his stomach drop as he began pulling individual transaction records and found hundreds of transfers he couldn't explain. Theodore's frantic call to his supervisor initiated the cascade that Zelensky had known would eventually come. Within minutes, the celebration atmosphere in Meridian Security Center had transformed into controlled panic. Within an hour, the FBI agents who'd been preparing to leave were instead staring at transaction logs that revealed the true scope of what had happened while they'd been focused on the ransomware. By then, Zelensky had completed 847 transactions, totaling $1.2 billion. The money had already fragmented across dozens of jurisdictions, converted to cryptocurrency, scattered through mixing services and privacy coins and cold storage wallets, whose keys existed only in his memory. At 4:23 a.m., Zelensky initiated the destruction protocols. Hard drives began overwriting themselves with random data, then overwriting again, then again, 7 passes that would render forensic recovery impossible. Servers that couldn't be wiped were physically destroyed, their components smashed and scattered. Documents came down from walls and fed into a barrel where they burned to ash. Every piece of hardware that had touched his operation would be reduced to unrecoverable debris. Zelensky worked methodically through the cleanup, his movements efficient and unhurried, even as sirens began wailing somewhere in the distance. By 5:30 a.m., the warehouse was nearly empty. The leather chair remained. The scattered cash had been collected into bags. One monitor still glowed in the darkness, connected to a battery backup that would keep it running for hours after everything else had been removed. On that monitor, 2 words pulsed in green text against a black background. House loses. Zelensky allowed himself a single moment. He closed his eyes. He exhaled slowly, releasing 18 months of tension in one long breath. Then he picked up his bags, walked out into the pre-dawn darkness, and disappeared. FBI Cyber Division Chief Yevgenia Morozova stepped out of the black SUV at 6:47 a.m. on March 17, 2021, and stood for a moment in the gray morning light, studying the warehouse that had already become the most significant crime scene of her 23-year career. The building was unremarkable. Rusted corrugated siding, windows opaque with decades of grime, a faded sign advertising a textile company that had gone bankrupt during the Reagan administration. Nothing about its exterior suggested that the largest cyber heist in history had been orchestrated from within its walls. That was the point, Yevgenia understood. Invisibility was the weapon. Anonymity was the armor. She was 51 years old. Her dark hair streaked with gray, she'd stopped bothering to dye. Her face carrying the lines of someone who had spent 2 decades staring at screens and chasing phantoms through digital labyrinths. She'd been born in Volgograd, defected to the United States at 19 through a complicated arrangement involving a visiting academic program and a CIA handler who'd recognized her potential. She'd built her career hunting exactly the kind of operative who'd built this command center, ghost-trained in the same Soviet-descended programs that had shaped her own early education in systems and vulnerabilities. The moment she stepped inside the warehouse, Yevgenia knew she was looking at the work of someone who understood those programs intimately. The space was nearly empty. Her forensics teams had already documented the scene, photographing scorch marks where servers had been burned, collecting fragments of destroyed hard drives that would yield nothing recoverable, cataloging the absence of evidence as carefully as they would have cataloged its presence. But one item remained exactly as it had been found, a single monitor, still glowing on battery power, displaying 2 words in green text against black. House loses. Yevgenia stood before that monitor for a long time. The arrogance of it, the theatrical flourish that transformed a crime into a statement. Whoever had done this wasn't simply stealing money. He was delivering a message to the casino industry, to law enforcement, perhaps to the world itself. He wanted them to know they'd been beaten. He wanted them to understand that all their security, all their technology, all their confidence had meant nothing against one mind with sufficient patience and skill. She recognized the psychology because she'd seen it before, decades ago, in training facilities where young prodigies learned to view systems as puzzles and penetration as art. The methodology was familiar too. The 18-month timeline, the layered infiltration, the distraction gambit that had consumed everyone's attention while the real operation proceeded invisibly. This wasn't American cybercrime, all smash-and-grab impatience and sloppy operational security. This was Russian, old school, the kind of work that took years to plan and minutes to execute. The investigation that followed became the largest in FBI Cyber Division history. Yevgenia commanded a task force of 47 agents, coordinated with counterparts in 23 countries, issued subpoenas to banks and cryptocurrency exchanges and corporate registries across 4 continents. The scale of the response matched the scale of the crime. The results did not. They recovered $20 million. Funds that had been frozen in a Singaporean account before the shell company could complete its transfer to the next node in the laundering chain. A rounding error. Less than 2% of the total stolen. The remaining $1.18 billion had fragmented so completely, scattered through so many jurisdictions and cryptocurrency networks, that reconstructing its path would have required cooperation from governments that had no interest in cooperating. International partnerships collapsed under the weight of diplomatic tensions and jurisdictional disputes. Estonia refused to share banking records without reciprocal concessions the United States wouldn't provide. Cyprus claimed its privacy laws prevented disclosure. Russia, predictably, stonewalled entirely, neither confirming nor denying any knowledge of operatives who might have trained in programs that officially didn't exist. Konstantin Dreyfus was arrested in April, found in his Newark apartment surrounded by evidence of his collaboration. He cooperated fully, providing everything he knew about the man who'd recruited him, which amounted to almost nothing. A voice on encrypted channels. A presence that seemed to know everything about casino security architecture. No name. No face. No location. The trail went cold in Montenegro. A security camera at Podgorica Airport captured a single image on March 18, 2021. A bearded man in a gray beanie boarding a small charter aircraft. The resolution was poor. The angle was oblique. But Yevgenia studied that image for hours, memorizing the posture, the gait, the unremarkable ordinariness of a figure who looked like any other traveler passing through a minor European airport. He looked, everyone who reviewed the footage agreed, like no one special, like someone you'd forget the moment you looked away. The aircraft's flight plan listed a destination in Albania, but it never arrived. Subsequent tracking attempts yielded nothing. The ghost had vanished into a world of false identities and non-extradition territories, carrying $1.18 billion that would never be recovered. 5 years later, Yevgenia Morozova retired from the FBI. She'd closed hundreds of cases in her career, brought down criminal networks spanning continents, testified before Congress about the evolving threat landscape of cyber warfare. But the Meridian case remained open. The file sat on her desk at home, a private office in a townhouse in Alexandria, where she spent her retirement mornings drinking tea and reviewing documents she'd memorized years ago. The last page of that file contained a photograph. It had been found on a memory card hidden in the warehouse, deliberately left behind, overlooked by forensics teams until a secondary sweep discovered it wedged beneath a floorboard. The image showed a man sitting in a leather chair, surrounded by monitors glowing with cascading code and floors covered with scattered cash. He was looking directly at the camera, not smiling, not gloating, simply present, a ghost who had chosen, for one moment, to be seen. Zelensky Ultreich Abramovich. The name had surfaced months into the investigation, pieced together from fragmentary intelligence and defector testimony. Rumors placed him in Paraguay, in Thailand, in a dozen countries where wealthy foreigners could purchase anonymity and governments asked no questions. Yevgenia looked at that photograph every morning. She studied the eyes of the man who'd beaten her, not with malice, but with the respect one professional affords another. They came from the same world, she and him, separated by choices made decades ago. She had chosen to build. He had chosen to destroy. Somewhere, she knew, he was still out there. Still free. Still winning. The house always wins, they say. But sometimes, just sometimes, a ghost proves them wrong. 5 years. 47 agents. 23 countries. And all they found was a photo. If you're not subscribed, you're doing exactly what Zelensky wanted. Standing in the wreckage, staring at a blinking screen, asking how it all happened. Hit subscribe before the next ghost disappears. Or head to the comments and write your confession. Why didn't you act when you had the chance?